So, psychology and neuroscience, I think in particular, but is extraordinarily compelling and interesting. In fact, I feel that the study of who we are, how we are made, how the components that build us and determine our personality, our behavior, our emotional states, our responses, our biases, is inherently, deeply fascinating. And so lots of people, I think, really want to know, what's going on, in the brain, in my brain, in other people's brains when they're reacting and responding in various, sort of social circumstances. Why is it, that we have, these inherent biases? Why do we respond often, while missing like a lot of the, structural features of our society, for example, that, hold some people back, abuse and harass, some individuals and privilege and, elevate, others? What is going on in our brains actually that can, make us, kind of blind in some circumstances or, insightful in others? So, there's an inherent fascination with the field of psychology, with understanding our perception, our cognition, and our behavior. And I'm going to tell you, my bias is towards, looking under the hood, seeing what actually is going on in the brain as a way to really get a handle on, the function, of these, what we'll see are various networks in the brain that allow for, our psychological experience. But, there's a lot that makes psychology very challenging too as a field. And I want to briefly go through some of these aspects, that present special challenges, for this inherently fascinating field, of psychology. So one, pretty, obvious aspect is that psychology, behavior is probabilistic. It's not necessarily deterministic or definitive in every case. There are lots of exceptions to quote rules, right? So behavior is actually, it turns out, rather difficult to predict. And there's a famous U.S. psychologist named Paul Meehl who back in the 1950s basically stated what became known as sort of Meehl's maxim, that the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. And I'm just going to lay that out there and let you think about it. In our, classroom, we can talk more about, what you think about Meehl's maxim, as something that can be potentially useful in terms of, trying to get a handle on what, behavior may, result in the future based on past behavior, but at the same time, how it can also be quite limiting or deterministic in some cases or abusive in other cases. So I want you to think about, when we're talking about, a natural science where, prediction is actually quite probabilistic. It's not necessarily deterministic. To have a maxim like that, how useful is that, kind of ultimately? And another, sort of complex, aspect of psychology, something that complicates the study of, perception and cognition and behavior is what psychologists like to talk about as how behavior is multiply determined. And I apologize in advance for some of these terms, but this is how scientists like to develop a separate language, right, with different terms that's kind of, they're often claiming it allows for, greater precision in language. We know what we're talking about, but at the same time, it can often be off-putting. And what this is. Behavior is multiply determined. It just means that lots of factors influence our behavior. There's more than one thing that's determining your behavior. But, again, psychologists will talk about how behavior is multiply determined. And what's important there is to think about how, it's often in, sort of popular press, or even in, conversation, et cetera, it's often like a single explanation for someone's behavior is often very popular, right? But skepticism is really actually quite, significantly warranted when, people ascribe this behavior to just one thing. Because, again, behavior, as we say, in, psychology is multiply determined. There's another very complex concept that makes psychology challenging, something called multicollinearity. And I've got resources, and we could talk more about this actually in sort of a live class session. But it basically refers to the fact that all of these factors that may be influencing our behavior in various complex social situations also influence each other. So there's lots of these, intercorrelations or interassociations amongst all these different variables that are influencing our behavior. And scientists or psychologists give this a fancy term called multicollinearity. And generally there's got to be some kind of statistical correction. When you're actually trying to write a paper, publish a paper, and come up with evidence for some kind of a association or a hypothesis that corrects or addresses the issue of multicollinearity. Often psychological influences are unknown. That's another important challenge. For those who are interested in studying, how we behave and how we respond and make predictions about behavior. Oftentimes we always actually, in every case, we bring our own biases and our own experience to a circumstance, and that means we miss a lot. That others from other circumstances and with other biases will focus on and be responding to. Oftentimes a lot of what we can sort of explicitly identify in a circumstance is not the only thing influencing our experience or our assessment of a circumstance or a situation or our behavior in that situation. There's a lot of conscious influences where we'll see that a stimulus, you may not catch it with a sort of conscious perceptual experience. However, it has influenced how your body is responding, and then how you're going to be feeling in a particular circumstance, which can, alter your behavior and your decision making. Another, kind of obvious aspect of, why psychology is challenging is that people actually affect each other and influence each other. So how one person is behaving in a circumstance will then influence how the other person then behaves, and then that can go back and forth. So they talk about this as the fancy terminology is reciprocal, back and forth determinism. So, my behavior affects your behavior and vice versa. People mutually influence each other's behavior. Many psychological concepts are actually quite difficult to define. And that's actually often like a real starting point, I think, for any kind of scientific investigation, any kind of natural scientific investigation, including studies in psychology, is what are we talking about? What is mental illness? What is schizophrenia? What is depression? What is memory? We're going to be talking about a number of different areas of intensive sort of psychological investigation and research, including learning and memory and consciousness. That's another big one, right? How do you define these terms? That's a really, really important, step. And I have a quote, that I kind of like from Toni Morrison. Definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. So a definition can leave out, a lot of people or a lot of aspects of a particular circumstance. But if you do narrow down a definition, it gives you a better, handle on then investigating maybe some of the structural or natural science underpinnings of memory or of attention or language or whatever it is you're trying to actually investigate in an experiment or with a sort of theoretical approach. So another challenge, something that makes psychology very challenging is the fact that the brain did not evolve to understand the brain. So this is very relevant to the study of neuroscience or psychology as a natural science. They call this the paradox of reflexivity. Like we're actually using our own brains to try to understand our own brains. And that's complicated because there are limitations, right? They're built-in limitations. They're things that you probably are not aware of. You don't have the architecture, to sort of process or represent or perceive or act upon, right? So, I think that's really interesting, actually, to sort of consider, the fact that we have this paradox of reflexivity. Then also, people in psychological research, if you ever were in a study, like some kind of a psychological research study, if you're a student at a university, in Europe, in the United States, you're often, a subject in a psychological experiment. They tend to use a very narrow slice of the population, often for, running studies in psychology. But you're signing a consent form, hopefully, and you're aware that this is a psychological experiment that you're involved in. So do you think that might change how you behave or react in that experiment? Just the understanding that you are being studied, that you are being evaluated, that you are being, kind of tested, and they're collecting data on what you do. So this is actually known as reactivity. It's the tendency for people to act differently if they know that they are actually the subjects of research. And this is also called the Hawthorne Effect, because there was a famous study. It was the Hawthorne electric plant in the Midwest United States, and they were looking at whether if they reduced the light level in the plant, how would that influence productivity. And everybody was told that they were going to see how productive they could be as they lowered the lights. And apparently the workers at this plant started working extra hard as the light levels got lower. So they were practically in the dark, and they had some of the highest levels of productivity. And that probably is not what would have happened if they had not known that they were actually in a psychological experiment. People are different. That's another critical aspect of that which makes investigations of psychology complicated, because we come from different experiences. We have different reactions to us based on all sorts of factors, and so that means that we have different perspectives, different biases, different experiences in various circumstances. So that also has impact on how we study decision making, emotional responses, temperament, behavior, etc. Cultural differences also play a significant role. Social scientists actually, when they're discussing research on various cultural groups, for example, we'll talk about emic research, where it's known as sort of immersive research, where it's supposed to be from the perspective of an insider, versus etic research, where you're kind of like observing from the outside. And I want you to think a little bit about that too. Like if you're a psychologist, at a university, and you want to do some kind of research in a community that you're not initially a part of, but you're going to immerse yourself in that community, right? Well, how immersed are you really? You're still coming from an outsider's perspective, and how are people going to respond to you? Trying to be ultimately, fully immersed. What are some of the limitations in terms of emic research, right? And what are some of the drawbacks of that kind of research too? Or what are some of the advantages of that kind of research? And if you're going to be an etic, take an etic approach, be an observer from outside, how outside are you if you're walking around, for example, with a clipboard and observing people's behavior? And I'm just observing, but you're still there. So that can also, so there's all sorts of challenges, obviously, with these various kinds of approaches. So can you think of more, complex, kinds of challenges, that influence, the study of our psychology, and its relationship actually to, the brain and the nervous system? I look forward to talking more about this with you in class.